But here we are, and if you're not sure of the nature of these exotic objects pictured on the screen, let me know at the break and I'll try to clue you in as to what they might be. So for tonight, I've sort of planned the festivities to fall into a couple of big chunks. The first one, I'll just spend a little bit of time talking about some of the contexts in which this research data world exists that lead it to be a little bit challenging for us to try to save and share and help other people save and share it. And I'll talk a little bit, and again, not exhaustively, because I know you guys have done a fair bit of reading and probably talking about this already, about specifically characteristics of the data that make it a little challenging to wrangle, as well as characteristics of the people who are tasked with managing and working with this data and why that makes things a little bit challenging too. Then we'll turn our attention more towards talking about some projects and tools. First, I'll let you guys talk a little bit. If you have chosen to take a look at a tool and want to make some remarks on it, that would be cool. I don't know if any of you did that or not, but we'll find out. And then I'll pick it back up and I'll talk about a couple of very, very different projects that I've been involved with in the world of trying to manage research data through various tools. But before we really kind of get started, I have to issue the standard disclaimer. These acronyms. Have you guys seen these before or know what they are? Anybody want to take a shot?
Institute?
It's more like internet speak. It's not anything.
Oh. In my eyes.
In my experience.
In my experience.
And this one usually has L at the end for I am not a lawyer, right? But I'm not an expert, exactly. So the things that, there you go, aren't you glad you came? So the things that I'm going to say that come out of my mouth tonight, please take with a heaping helping grain of salt of these two acronyms. My world is still very much colored by the things that I saw working at the bench, especially because that was still a much bigger part of my experience than being a librarian, because I spent umpty million years or so working in science, and that colored my perceptions for how these things are actually managed or not. Again, in my experience, not the way everybody does it, hopefully. And I'm still sort of, I haven't been a librarian all that long, to be honest, and so the way that librarians look at this world is a little bit new to me, and I'm still sort of adjusting to that. And a lot of my experience is with primary research data, like as generated and comes off of an instrument that's sitting on a lab bench. That was my world for many years. So, keeping that in mind, I thought I'd take a quick look at some of the things that make managing this data sort of an interesting challenge. And the first is the whole nature of the grant funding cycle. So, in a nutshell, you write a grant. If you're very fortunate, the grant gets funded. You have a nice big chunk of money. And in the sciences, typically what happens is a good piece of that money then goes to purchase a piece of equipment or a machine that will help measure something for you and will help you prove your case, help you get the experiments done. And oftentimes grant funding is used to do that because these things are horrendously expensive and they're not anything that anybody could afford in the general course of business. So your nice big fancy new machine is purchased with your grant money, which is great. One of the potential issues there, of course, is that, like, nice catch, like all good things, grant funding runs out. And so once the money runs out, sometimes too runs out the mechanism for supporting that piece of equipment, for maintaining it, as well as for maintaining and supporting the data that it may be still collecting. Of course, the big outlay is buying it in the first place, but of course there are also costs with keeping it, up to date and functioning correctly. Scientists are very clever people, and they tend to be pretty collaborative in nature. And so when somebody in a department gets a nice big expensive piece of equipment, what often happens is that other people who study in similar areas use it also, because they're like, we've got this great new cell sorting machine now, and so you guys can use it, and you guys can use it, and that way it's not sitting there unused for so long, and now you don't have to buy microscope time at the lab down the street to do it. You can do it here. And that's fantastic, and that's exactly probably what should happen. But what I have seen happen is once that machine is there for a number of years, people tend to forget who owns it. And that means that nobody really takes care of it anymore. It's like this sad little orphan machine that has piled up files and files and files and files, and nobody has ever cleared them off because nobody can tell what's important and what's not. So there may, at the outset when this thing was purchased, it may have been that somebody was tasked to take care of it, but that person hopefully has graduated and gone on to other things at that point. That was a very kind of ham-handed way of saying something that Dorothea Salo typically says very cleanly when she says something like the cyclical nature of grant funding does not work with long-term preservation. Same idea. Data, of course, is quite changeable, as I think you probably know from your own experience and have seen through your readings and such. In a lab, you have machines, all sorts of different machines generating all sorts of different data at the hands of different people. In order to tell their experimental story, they take those data streams and they munge them together, and they combine them and they refine them multiple times sometimes. And so it's very difficult to decide at which point in that process you need to capture everything, and whether it's okay to just let some things go by the wayside. If you decide to throw out certain measurements because they don't fit, which people do all the time, is that okay, or should you memorialize that in some way? So that makes it a bit of a challenge. Also, and this was very true in my world, some of this data is really, really ephemeral on purpose, which is a hard thing, I think, for some of us to grasp in our world of we keep things forever until we have to weed them, right? So mostly what I studied was sort of on the boundary of molecular biology and cell biology, and we would do experiment after experiment after experiment, and we would look at the data and say, that doesn't make sense, because things go wrong constantly. And you just kind of put it aside and move on. You know, you may make some notes about it, but then you toss out your readings and you move on and you do it again. And so you may lose an important story in doing that. And in my former discipline, that was really easy to do because your materials are really inexpensive, relatively speaking. It's very easy to grow a new culture of yeast. It takes a couple of days. It takes the cost of some solutions and some time, but it's really no big deal. And so oftentimes, again, in my experience, you guys should have a drinking game for how many times I say that tonight, and I'm going to say it all the time. People would rather recreate an experiment and do it over than try to figure out what they did 6 months ago. Because they'll have a more clearer, they feel like they can better capture it. And a lot of times you have to repeat these things anyway. So I think I mentioned this, if you guys read the Lurking in the Lab paper. One of the machines I found in that lab, in that teaching lab, is designed to continuously overwrite its oldest data files. And that makes a lot of sense because the data files are huge. Again, a lot of times they get tossed, they get looked at, and you move on. But oftentimes, you don't really know what primary research data is going to be most important until months later, when you start to get a clearer picture of what's really happening. And so from the lab manager point of view or the PI point of view, it's sort of fantastic that this machine is constantly making new space on its hard drive, because that means that nobody has to cancel their lunch hour to run out to Best Buy to get another terabyte to hook up to something, right? So you never run out of space, and that's great. But you might need that at some point. And if you're in a discipline where it's hard to recreate that data for whatever reason, whether it's expensive, which it wasn't for me, or whether it takes a lot of time, like an ecologist who's looking at like the cycling of predator-prey relationships on an island over the course of 25 years, that person's not going to throw away any data, hopefully, because they'd have to start over. So some of this data is designed to just sort of go away, which is, I think, a hard thing for us to grasp. And it may be something that changes because who knows what will happen with data sharing and saving mandates down the line. It may be that those start to grow into more of the primary data. Who knows? I don't know. That will be an interesting time. And lastly, this is my personal bugaboo, I think, is that this is still a very proprietary world. A lot of these primary research data files are they're proprietary file types. They're actually generated by their own little proprietary machines. It's this entire proprietary ecosystem. And of course, those companies that make those machines have no vested interest in making a file that's easy for anybody else to use. They want you locked into their excellent, expensive ecosystem. And the trade-off here is that they make their machines and their software very easy to use. But the librarian in me sees that landscape and sees warning signs. Now it's true, again, if a lot of that data is going to be thrown away, maybe it's not a big deal. And it's also true that for a lot of that data, it can be transformed into other file types, but sometimes, of course, you guys know from transforming file types that sometimes you lose information doing that. So it's a proprietary landscape for sure. Looking at the people challenges, that sounds a little harsh. I don't mean the challenges of the people themselves necessarily, more sort of the world that they live in. And the first is the role of the PI in a research group, or the principal investigator, the head of the lab. It's usually a faculty member, but it varies sometimes. So again, my experience, drink. These folks often have surprisingly little knowledge of what happens day to day in their labs because they're doing 5 million other things. They are writing grant proposals, they're writing articles, they are still grading things if they're still teaching, which most of them are teaching at least some classes. They are spending a lot of time, hopefully, mentoring and helping lead their graduate students and their undergraduate research assistants and their staff members. And they're doing, in addition to all that, as if that's not enough, they're doing also all of the joyous little things that go along with living in academia, like serving on committees, right? But what happens day to day, the nitty-gritty of what goes on in their labs, especially if these folks are established in their careers and they've been there a while, they don't really know what's happening in the lab a lot of times, in my experience. That's one reason why it can be really fruitful if you're trying to talk to people about research data management and the pains that they're suffering because of it, to focus a lot of that outreach on graduate students and staff members because they're the people that are living it. And the PI thinks everything's cool because nobody's complaining to them, of course, because that's their boss. There's also this interesting idea of collaboration without co-location, which is difficult to say without a lot of caffeine. It's an amazing new landscape, really, for science and really any kind of research because your collaborators can be all over the globe now. The internet makes it so easy for people to communicate with each other and share results instantly that a lot of these research teams, if you look at the affiliations of the authors on a scientific paper some night when you can't sleep, you'll see that some of them are just spread all over the place. That's a really cool development. And it's also true that it takes so much more data than ever before to actually successfully get a paper published. The bar used to be much, much lower for making a publication. Even back in my day, the bar was lower. It just keeps going up and up and up. There's a scientist I know who jokes that figure 1A in a Cell paper that comes out in 2015 is what a Cell paper from 2000 looked like. That used to be enough to publish a paper. But now you need more and more and more to get your paper published, which of course is an important activity, as we all know. So on a lot of levels, that's a really cool development. That's really fantastic. It also means that the data and information from that project is spread across the globe, because usually each person has their little slice of the pie of the project, and they're working on the piece that is their personal expertise. And you have to sort of trust that they're doing the right thing and that they're safeguarding their data and they're taking care of it and they're saving it in a format such that other people can use it down the line and it's backed up and all that good stuff. So now you have to have this trust in the people that you work with because you're not seeing every day what they're doing. finally, you have this situation where there's a lot of variability in practices. A lot of it is pretty ad hoc in terms of managing research data in the lab or the group. And there's a lot of turnover inherent in that. So, for example, you guys may be totally shocked to hear this, but if there is any one person in the group who is charged with keeping an eye on making sure people's data looks clean and is collected the right way, that is not a glamorous job. That's not a job that people are like going, ooh, ooh, pick me to do. It's often sort of down there with like safety officer. These are the things that get kind of shoved, unfortunately, oftentimes on the person that's new. Because for one thing, it is a great way to sort of learn the work of a lab group by sort of seeing what kind of data people are collecting and how they're organizing their files. It's part of sort of apprenticing in a science group. But it's considered, it's scut work. It's not glamorous and it's not sexy, believe it or not. So it often kind of goes to the person who's lowest in the pecking order. And that's if there is any one person that's charged with keeping an eye on this in an overarching way. Oftentimes, in my experience, there isn't. It's sort of every person for themselves kind of scenario. If there is one person tasked with this, it is usually a student. And of course, we all know what students do. They graduate, hopefully, right? And then they go on in their careers, which means, you know, if you're tasking a master's student with that, that chore is turning over every, year or two. If you're tasking a PhD with it, it's turning over every 4 or 5 years. You have somebody new coming in to take over. I've also seen it happen more than once, understandably, that if the person that is tasked with one of these sorts of delicious, juicy roles of doing things like taking care of research data, if they have some sort of big deadline approaching, so if they have qualifying exams coming up, if they're writing a paper, if they have to defend their dissertation, then your PI is going to pull somebody else aside and say, Joe is just up to his ears, and can you take over this stuff for him for 6 months? And so it changes a lot. And I think the landscape is changing a little bit, and people are realizing that the more you directly instruct people about how to take care of this research data, the fewer headaches you'll have down the line. But there's still there's not a lot of overt training out there for this stuff, and which presents a nice opportunity for us, I think, maybe to get in there. Instead, it's more of a scenario of do it like the person before you did it, and we'll figure things out from there. If you guys took a look at the Lurking in the Lab paper, there was a figure there of file names that always makes me giggle. So those were undergrads, and I shouldn't pick on them too much because they're undergrads and they're learning, but I'll tell you, I saw an awful lot of files on research lab hard drives that look like that too. So it's not just because they're new. So at this point, you may be asking yourselves this question. So the researcher screws up and they don't take care of their stuff as well maybe as they could. We've all done something like that, right? We've all not backed up our files and then got bitten by it. We've all lost a laptop for some reason. And then you learn, and hopefully you do these things better going forward. But there's some ramifications, and I would argue that the ramifications happen to the person involved as well as they ripple out from that person too. So here's a case in point. This was a paper that came out in PeerJ, and it was picked up by, I think that's the Chronicle. Yes, the Chronicle had kind of the juicier headline, so I put it up here. This came out a couple years ago now, and this is a crazy study where I think this was mostly in biology, they found expert scientists who had been working in their fields of like neuroscience and immunology for years. And they gave them papers in their discipline to read, and they said, can you tell us what materials were used to generate these results? And what is the number? They could only correctly identify the research materials used in those papers 53% of the time. These are people that work in the same stupid sub-discipline. And my favorite part of this story, maybe, is, and this is a quote, in neuroscience, immunology, developmental molecular, my people, and general biology, somebody has gone to the trouble to make catalog codes for these things. but nobody uses them. Isn't that brilliant? So, metadata, who needs it, right? It's, metadata, schmetadata. This is another one. This is current biology. Where's Megan? Where's Megan? 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 Who's our reading summarizer? Awesome. Okay. You're about to come up. You're about to be up. So here's another one, fairly recent article. This was in Current Biology, reported by a bunch of Canadian, I think, biologists. And the headline here is picked up from the Smithsonian because, again, they're better at writing juicy headlines than scientists are. And this study showed that a whole bunch of raw data from old scientific studies is perhaps now missing. Did anybody look at a tool? Anything you want to tell us about it? I think we asked you to tell us its name, who it was created by, what its intended purpose or audience is, description, comments. Go!
So I looked at the data asset framework, which I think it was on the list from the Digital Curation Center, and it doesn't seem to be publicly accessible, so
Nice.
I wasn't sure who it was, and it didn't seem to be branded with a name. So it calls itself a set of methods to gather information, views, and experiences you need to scope research data support services. So I guess my understanding was it was kind of like a framework that's set up so that if you're starting at the beginning of providing support to researchers, you can figure out how to scope your services to help identify and assess how organizations are managing research data, to actually create a survey and to kind of assess researchers' workflow, and then to move from that point to making recommendations for data management services. So that was all that I could surmise from their very brief description.
And what was the name of that tool again?
It was Data Asset Framework.
Oh, yeah.
And then, interestingly, they also call themselves the Data Audit Framework. So I don't know if that was a change in name at some point.
It's still an A.
Yeah, exactly. The acronym never changes.
Anybody else?
I started to look at them, but there were so many, and so I got overwhelmed. And I looked at a few, and what I decided to just have my takeaway be that if there's a part of data management that you want help with, there's a tool, or possibly 10. So yeah, that's all that I had.
There's one we looked at at the beginning of the class. Anybody want to say anything about that? Beginning of the course?
Oh, the DMP.
DMP
tool.
tool.
DMP tool.
I haven't
Maybe
really
I
played
haven't
around
seen it.
with it, so I don't know what to say about that.
We also looked at electronic lab notebooks a lot, and specifically lab archives.
Evan came? Did Evan come?
Yes.
Yeah.
we did. Yeah, and
Small
we-
world.
Yeah, and we had the founder
Oh, cool.
too. So, what about those?
We're just talking general tools to deal with data, right?
Yeah.
I just want to make sure. Okay.
It's hard, right? Because, as you'll see when I start talking again, unfortunately for all y'all, what do you consider a tool?
Right.
It can be really broad.
Right.
So one of the tools I'm going to talk about is essentially a repository, which, so yeah, it could be, I wouldn't necessarily have thought of DMP tool as a tool, but it's right in the name,
Librarian's little helper?
Yeah. It's funny, I have to give a session on that tomorrow. So I was hoping you had some good comments for me.
Yeah, it is kind of a wild world out there, right? It's sort of the opposite of what it used to be, where there was absolutely no option for managing. Now there are probably too many for managing. Okay, so I'll take her away. So I asked you guys to take a look at some things and consider them because you're right, there's too many out there. I don't know all of them by any means. So I selfishly use this class as a means of helping me learn some of the other things that are out there. But I'll just talk next about a couple of tools that I've been specifically involved with. And the first one was made by a group of scientists, and the second one was made by a group of librarians. And they have, as you'll probably see, some pretty large differences between them, probably partly as a result of the people who made them. So the first one came out of the Harvard School of Public Health, specifically their bioinformatics core group. And it was a project that was aimed at trying to provide essentially enriched records to help people understand these things that are geo data sets that are on deposit in NCBI. So part of that PubMed universe we all know and love so much. So they could see that there was an issue, there was a gap between being able to read these papers that talked about gene expression, microarray data, and understanding the data set that was deposited with it. And they were trying to get together a group of people who were mostly graduate students, life sciences graduate students in this area, to make these records to sort of give people a leg up and better understand what they were seeing. And the reason for this is that gene expression microarray data is a weird beast because you can't really make a lot of sense out of what you're seeing unless you really, really understand all of the experimental conditions that went into that work. So the experimental conditions that gave rise to that data have a huge impact on the data that you see. And that's in contrast to something like a DNA sequence, where you sequence a piece of DNA, it doesn't really matter how you go about it generally, or what solvents you use, or what chemicals. It's always going to be GATCCT, yada, yada, yada. And the way you treated that sample doesn't really matter, by and large. But the geo data is not like that. So at this point, you might be thinking, so Jen, seriously, what is the big deal here? Because these folks already have a huge advantage over a lot of disciplines, because these molecular biologists have the paper on deposit in PubMed. They have the geoset that's linked to it in the same ecosystem infrastructure in the geo gene expression omnibus database. So really, you can't even, that's not good enough, because a lot of disciplines don't even have that. But again, it's a little hard to understand without the context, and so that's where the curation team came in. And what we did was we read the papers painstakingly, tried to correlate the details in the paper, especially the stuff in the materials and methods in the paper that talks about things like cell strains and probes, with the information on deposit in Geo, and using this little piece of open source Java-based software that you can download off SourceForge, even today, I believe, you create a marked up, basically metadata enriched record that sort of ties those two things together a little bit better. In case you're curious, the way they found these suckers to do the curation work for them was they put out a call mostly on graduate student listservs, and I was working at Brandeis at the time, and I was lurking on the life sciences grad student listserv, and I saw this, I was like, wow, that's really cool, because I wanted to do something with data, and in my job I really wasn't. And I said, would you guys consider Librarian? And they said, wow, that's a really good idea, because you know about things like control vocabulary. So it was a bunch of grad students and me doing this. And I'll say that at the time I did this work, my science was rusty, and this was not an area that I did any work on at the bench by any means. It was really painstaking to make these things. So let me show you what one of them looks like. For me, it would take probably 8 hours, at least, to read the paper to try to understand what they did, and then translate that into the software to make this enriched record. 8, that's a really big investment of time. And it was partly, again, because I was out of science shape, so to speak. But this is what this looks like, and I know it's ridiculously small. But a lot of the information comes directly from the paper. That's things like the title and the abstract. That's all the text that's up at the top. But a lot of what the curators added is in that gray box there. And I blew it up so that hopefully you can see part of it. I can read it to you. Those include details like what the cell type was, what strain of organism was used for these experiments. A lot of these experiments were done on mice, maybe including this one. I don't know, I can't read the type that small. The age of the organism that was used, what the part was of the tissue. In this case, this came from bone marrow. What the protein markers were that were looked at for the study, and the label, how they were labeled. So this was done using a biotin label. Yes?
So what it looks like, and for me to understand it better, it's sort of like what, are you familiar with lab archives?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay,
I
so basically when people are putting in their notes, they are also tagging it with stuff like this. So it's sort of like retroactively doing that tagging that somebody, that they either did do, but personally, but they probably just didn't even do. It's sort of going back and putting that key information, that like, instrument, sample, all of that stuff, and associating it with the record.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah. I think that probably in some labs, some of this information wouldn't even be recorded. So like some labs are always going to work with bone marrow. And so they're not even going to bother putting that there because they know. They're like, it's bone marrow, that's what I do. But if you're reading it 5 years later and you have no affiliation with this lab, you don't know. And it's, again, the information's there in the paper, but you really have to, it takes a long time for me. Yeah.
Is this something that you think could be automated ever?
That's a good question. That seems like a really good idea, doesn't it? To have it scraped and put in or something. And that's probably something that as lab notebooks continue to evolve, maybe they will be able to do that a little bit better. But again, it still comes down to the person doing it to some extent. If you could scrape the paper, maybe, and pull the terms out.
So I'm thinking about like text mining of some sort,
Yeah.
and at least if you had like a list of all the different organism parts, then it could scan for an organism part word, and then potentially fill that in.
It could be a little dangerous.
Yes.
Huge sauce word.
It would.
Yeah.
Yeah, I said ever.
Well, it seems like it could do it, and then at least like highlight the words for a person to go through.
Yeah,
and
so
look at it,
that's
because
right,
then you at least wouldn't have to literally read the paper so closely. It could highlight the ones like bone marrow, and you could look and be like, does this fit with that? Okay, good, yes. Like and check. If it pulled up, notice like if it could totally see things like number of weeks, and like if it says number and then week has a number and it has weeks, or like any of these words that mean number. And says weeks, it could highlight it and it could have you associate it with something. So it would definitely save some time at the very
But
end.
if it highlighted heart and then you read of the matter, you would say no.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not.
So at least
Yeah.
you then have a person looking at it, but it would be a lot faster, I would imagine.
I mean, one of the interesting things we ran into with this project is IsoTab, the IsoTool software, has built into it a whole bunch of scientific ontologies, right? But when we were trained to use the software, we were actually, the person training us, you're taping this, aren't you? Great. The person training us said, just put in free text. Because it's easier. And then you don't have to pick which ontology, and the librarian in me is going, and from looking at some of these papers, for one thing, there's pressure on authors not to put too much in the materials and methods. They want them shorter, which is funny, because at the same time we're saying all your data needs to go in there, but don't talk about how you did anything, which makes it even harder for people to understand what happened. And so a lot of this information is in supplements now. So you have to be a little creative about where you find it, because it's not always, like some of these papers I'll be looking at and I'm going, am I crazy? I don't secretly talk about the years. Oh, there's a supplemental file. So if there was more, a more consistent approach to where this information went, that would be a huge help, honestly. And seems like that's something that could be done, really. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It would be an interesting exercise to throw some computation at this problem and see what happens. Because taking 8 hours to do one of these is not particularly sustainable. And again, like I said, I'm sure some of the real scientists were better at it than I was, but it was surprisingly time consuming.
Is this software though meant to be done retroactively, or is it meant to be done as you submit a paper?
That's such a fantastic question. So my understanding, I was involved with this project for a short time. My understanding is when they originally designed this ISATools software suite, they thought the researchers were going to do it. And they thought that the researchers were going to do it maybe at the time of publication or as they were doing the experiments. And of course, the researchers could do this really fast, I'm sure. But we know how that works, don't we? So the researchers weren't doing it. And so they said, let's hire these poor grad students to mark these up. And so the grad students did it, but it took them forever. And so they sort of went back and forth on that model. And then after they had, like the 15 of us working, then they went to a model where they had a dedicated staff member or two for a while that was just doing these. And now they've switched in a different way that I'll tell you about in a little bit. So they're kind of backsy-forthsy on who they think is going to use this, I think. But I think the original intent was for the researchers to do it. And yeah. So thank you for the segue. Where this thing is now, they have, at the last time I looked at this project, which was I think earlier this year, they've collected about 50 of these annotated studies. And those 50 annotated studies have provided these enriched metadata records for the primary research data in the form of the stuff that just came off the microarray, as well as the derived data, so things like gene lists that come out, and sometimes the investigation as a whole, too. So it's about 50 studies, which doesn't sound like much, but altogether that's almost 1,000 assays of various kinds. And I believe that's still up and available on the web. I was able to access it not too long ago. You can still download this ISATab software suite. It includes not just this little Java-based applet that generates a nice CSV file, tab delimited file for you of this metadata, but it also includes like a validation piece and a checker and all this other stuff. For a while there, they were putting a lot of their efforts into developing some metadata crosswalks, and so they have, because they're scientists, they were mostly walking back and forth to different scientific schemas, and so they went from ISATab metadata, so standard, to MAGE-tab, which is similar, and OWL, which is something else, and RDF, which we might actually recognize that acronym. And I think maybe in January of this year, there was an interesting announcement that came out. So Nature Publishing Group now has a data papers journal called Scientific Data, and ISATab is going to be the metadata standard for that. And if I remember, I thought, well, how are they going to do that? That's interesting. They have, I think, what they called an in-house curation team that's going to make these ISATab records for the papers that are accepted and then submitted. So they've gone back to paying somebody to do it, basically, again. But they do offer sort of a DIY option. They're still holding out hope that a researcher will generate these and saying, if you want to do it yourself, that's cool, too. You can do that. So that's where things stand with that. It was a really interesting thing to be involved with on a lot of levels. I have lost track of my notes. There we go. So this is the library version, and I brought handouts. There you go. Oh man, that actually flies nicely. Frisbee, frisbee. You guys want? Yep. You're welcome. So on a very different note, this is the library version. Northeastern has had a conventional repository, however you define that, the sort of thing that takes theses and dissertations and scholarly works for, I don't know, before I got there, 5 years, 8, I don't know, for quite a while, but they saw the need to make something that was a little bit more robust and flexible and could take a whole bunch of different kinds of objects. pretty much anything that can be created or used at the university. And so the vision was to have this include teaching objects that are hard to share back and forth between people, digital collections of any kind, and the part that I care about is the red part here, including research data. And of course, because this is built by librarians, the manifesto behind it is we want to make this stuff discoverable to people so they can see what's happening on campus. We want to make it easier for people to find collaborators. We want to make it easier for people to share their data. But that said, there's a whole bunch of very granular permissions that can be put in place with this stuff too, so that you can make things private that you want to be kept private. So that's the official glossy version of the vision. I had to share this because this came out of our associate dean's mouth one day, that we have to respect that most of us chose not to actually be librarians, and most people don't actually enjoy creating these very rich, detailed records to make things findable. They just want to put something somewhere and be done with it. So that's the pithier version of the vision, is to make it as simple to use as possible. And in doing so, this is the flip side of that very, very painstaking, very careful, marked up ISATAB world. The only thing you need to submit something to the repository right now is, I think you need a title and a single keyword, and that's it. And anything else, we don't care. Go nuts. Put it in there. That's fine. So the technical specs for this thing, I'm not going to talk about too much because I'm going to very quickly get in over my head because that's not my bailiwick. But in order to make this thing very flexible and robust, it's built in Fedora. It has a Hydra front end programmed with Ruby on Rails. Let's just pretend I said the right thing there. Awesome. Solar for indexing and Blacklight for search and browse. And I think I got those right, and please correct me if I didn't. Awesome. And the way this works is people can self-deposit. Faculty and staff are all automatically have permissions to do this without any human intervention whatsoever. Some people are actually doing it, somewhat to my surprise, depositing stuff all the time. But there's also this interesting consultative piece that comes in for more complex projects and for people who aren't sure whether it's the right solution for them. And I'll tell you that we've struggled a little bit with who is involved in that discussion with faculty and staff and researchers. I think we've found kind of the sweet spot with that now, and we just vary the people that go out to talk to them depending on what the project is like. So yesterday, actually, I went with our repository manager, who is a former metadata librarian, to go talk to an assistant dean in the health sciences who has a project that she's working on for which she thinks is a good solution. And it's because it wasn't a data project, really. I went along because I was the closest thing to a science librarian who had time in her schedule, closest thing to a health sciences librarian. So the folks that go along vary. It's always the repository manager because she knows the nitty-gritty of what's possible. We try to involve the liaisons as much as possible in that conversation. They don't always have a lot to add necessarily, but they're the people who have the relationships already with the folks that are being talked to. And of course, from my perspective, it's super important for them to know what people are working on and what their interests are, and to just sort of sit there and be part of it. Someone else who gets pulled into these conversations fairly often is our scholarly communications librarian, because people have questions about whether they have permission to deposit certain things or not. Yeah?
I was actually going to ask that.
Yeah?
If they have to select the licensing or the permissions when they deposit. You just said title and keywords. There's no place. Is there an automatic, like, if they don't?
There's a little checkbox at the bottom that says, I solemnly swear that I have permission to deposit the stuff. So yes, there is. Okay. You do sort of affirm that you are okay with depositing things. And so yeah, our ScholComm person gets called in quite often to talk about whether, I can put this preprint in or the finished product so she's been a great resource for that. Again, this thing is designed to be simple, hopefully, for people to use, and it's also designed, hopefully, to not require a lot of staff time. And so that's why we're okay with people depositing with very minimal metadata, title, one keyword, you're done. We're also employing Perl scripts to do some of the metadata dirty work for us. So because we know people aren't going to want to mark up their record in the same way every time, right? So an example of this is one of our early adopter groups for this project is the group that we affectionately call MARCOM, Marketing and Communications, who take pictures constantly. And they started using the repository very early because pictures were something we could handle, that we understood how to describe, right? And we wanted to see what would work best for them. So they were some of our early test subjects, sounds a little harsh. Lucky early adopters, that's what it is. And as a result of working with them, we've gotten things to the point where all they have to do when they go out on campus and take pictures is we've made zip uploaders that are specific to their needs that will, all they have to do basically is they have to say, they've set up I think 8 different collections, really broad collections that mimic the way they treated their print photos back in the day. So like athletics, president has his own, of course. Academics, campus, right? Really broad categories. So they choose which of those collections their event fits, dump it into the zip loader, and from there, there's some Perl scripting magic that happens that extracts some of the information from the image header and repurposes it as metadata. And again, I'm out of my element, so I'm hoping I'm saying this right. So that you don't have to do things like apply dates, because that's part of the package of the picture anyway, so why make somebody apply a date to it? It also automatically, because this is something that Marcom told us they wanted, they said, you know, it'd be really great if you could make thumbnails for all these images so we could see them, and a web quality image from each one, and then of course the archival. And the archival, no one has permission to see but faculty and staff, I think, and then the thumbnail and the web quality version, everybody has permission to see. So the Perl scripts also automatically generate that thumbnail, automatically generate that web quality image. So humans don't have to do it, except write the Perl scripts. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no.
Do you know if, you said that the zip uploader, they can upload to a collection like president or whatever. So if it went into the president, let's say, collection, does it also automatically get like a metadata tag of like president? You know, like
I'm not sure. It wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't surprise me.
So it might also have other metadata that would be automatically put onto whatever it is because it's going into this collection.
Because they say anything in this collection has tag president. Yeah, probably. Yeah, I think so. Don't quote me, but it wouldn't surprise me because again, the whole idea is let's dump a lot of resources into making the infrastructure really do a lot of the work for us, and then the people won't have to be involved as much. So yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. But some of what we call the high value objects still get human metadata, and that's mostly things that we would consider scholarly. So papers, data is one of those things, yay. But a lot of it, especially because there's a big chunk of materials that are going to go up here that are essentially administrative, you know, like sociology department newsletters, those aren't going to get human metadata. They're just going to get whatever that person applies to them. Is that what I want to say about that? So the data piece is still a little behind. You know, librarians know and archivists know how to deal with pictures. We know how to deal with documents, that's for sure. The data has been a little bit slower in coming, which is understandable. But there is this group that we're working with right now called the Ocean Genome Legacy. Believe it or not, Northeastern has a marine sciences department, which is hysterical, right? I had no idea. There's a whole campus in Nahant. And, you know, I'm lobbying to get the library moved out there, but I don't think I'm going to be successful because it's beautiful. Anyway. So this project came to Northeastern probably 2 years ago now. It's a really cool project. This is their manifesto, basically. It's a research institute. They're collecting samples of threatened biological samples in the ocean. Here's a little bit more about them. They have a lot of specimens, archived DNA extracts, species. And this is what their front end looks like right now. So they essentially have built what looks to us like a library catalog, really, from scratch for their collection of samples. And they did this because researchers want to contact them and say, do you have a piece of gill tissue from, I'm not even going to try to say the genus name of that, Abu Duff? Really? That looks like a joke. That doesn't look like Latin. That looks like it's like a cat walks on your keyboard. So they have home built this catalog, and it's really a way for people to search, mostly other scientists, to search for the specimens and see if these folks have a specimen of an organism they want to work on, and in that case they can order it. See, there's a little cart thing there. It's at no cost, so there's no money that changes hands. You order it and they send it to you on dry ice, wherever you may be. It's pretty cool, right? So this catalog has been sort of cobbled together in various ways, and they're not happy with it anymore because they have a lot of specimens, and this thing is very slow to load, and it's clunky, and you can't search it in ways they want to search it. So they said, can you help us with us? And we said, us with this? And we said, oh yeah, definitely. So there's kind of a lot going on there, but it's nothing we can't deal with. It's pictures. We know how to deal with pictures. There's a lot of measurements, so like how long is the fish sort of thing, gender and life stage, text stuff, and there's some geographical coordinates. And so we're like, oh yeah, totally, we can do that. That'd be fun. That'd be great. But then they said, so there's another piece of this. Can you help us? What we really want is to get the catalog working better. And if we can serve that up through the repository, that would be great. And we can take advantage of your solar and blacklight, and the indexing and the searching will be so much better. And we're like, absolutely. And they said, well, we also have kind of a laboratory information management issue. So on their back end, they have some stuff that down the road a piece, they're hoping we can help them with too. It's incredibly complicated and complex and amazing the detail they have on their specimens. And so they have let us into their shared drive, and so we can spelunk around in there and see what it is. And it's spreadsheet city, and I don't know if you guys have run into this truism yet, but it's a truism that any data management project you have involves at least one spreadsheet. It just never fails. Never fails. And so there are plenty here. Multiple different spreadsheets for the same thing. And they're all full of this incredibly rich information. So there's information about the organism itself, which includes, of course, the genus and species names. It includes the gender of the thing that was collected, its life stage, so was it a juvenile, was it an adult? It includes the name of the person that collected it. It includes the date it was collected. It includes even, it's my personal favorite, whether it was found associated with another organism. So was there a sea lamprey hanging off this thing when you collected it? Was it eating a piece of grass, marine grass, eelgrass, something? There's another layer of spreadsheets that just deals with the samples that they have on file. So this is definitely not a one-to-one correlation. Every organism has a gajillion samples of it, because there are samples of different tissues. There are samples of gill, fin, eyeball, probably not eyeballs. There are multiple samples within each of those categories. There's information about how all of the samples were prepared, what solvent they're stored in, what the date of preparation was, which is different from the date of collection, where it's actually stored in their freezer, which is pretty awesome, which is something that they could really benefit from lab archives with, something like that. There's also location information, so the geographical coordinates we saw on their little map of the Great Barrier Reef, the name of the place, so I don't know.
It was Lizard Island or something.
Lizard Island, awesome.
Yeah,
Lizard Island. In addition to your mapping coordinate, sometimes even the depth of the ocean at which it was found, characteristics of the area. So they'll often have things like it was silty. The bottom was silty, the bottom was rocky, the water was brackish, the water wasn't moving very much. Just amazingly detailed. And on top of all that, as if that's not enough, they have collection information. So for these folks, each sailing is a collection event. So the boat goes out, and that's your collection event. So with each collection event, that boat usually stops at multiple locations. So it goes out of Nahant, and it stops at Marblehead. Then it goes down to the Cape for lunch. Then it comes up to Quincy, and then it goes back to Boston. So it stops like 4 times. So there's 4 different collections that happen on that one collection event. There are 10 people on the boat, all collecting. They have detailed every person that was on the boat at the time and what they're collecting, the collection method for these things. So was it caught by a net? Was it taken by hand? Just insanely detailed. And they even have in some cases, if they needed to get a permit to collect from a certain area, they have the information on that there too. So permit number, permit granting agency. It's like, it's amazing. It's amazing. It's really complicated. So there's a lot of spreadsheets.
They don't have a library on staff. They just deal.
They have a staff scientist who basically her job is to deal with this stuff. It's crazy. They also have their photos, which are stored in Lightroom. This made the repository manager very happy to hear, because apparently we have pulled things out of Lightroom before, and they have certain kinds of metadata that you can automatically extract easily. Got me. But she was happy to hear about it. Lightroom. The photos are stored in Lightroom. And we have access to that too, so we can see what's in there. A lot is in there. And they also store some data elsewhere. And early in our conversations, they said, is it okay if we don't store everything with you guys? And we said, are you kidding me? Absolutely. Yes, please. Because we've never sort of taken the view that everything, if you archive with us, everything must be in there, especially for things. So they have their DNA sequences in something called Genius, which is a piece of software that lets you line up commonalities between organisms. And we would never build something that lets you do that, and why would we? Because there are discipline-specific repositories that let you do that. So we're like, sure, keep them in there, and if you want, we can link to them. Done. So where we stand with that project, it has really stopped and started. Really? You're happy about the Darwin Core?
This is the thing.
Yeah.
This is metadata schema?
Yeah.
Yeah,
You know.
Cool.
This is where we are. It's been stoppy-starty, as I think these projects often are. And it's partly because they lost their staff scientist, and then they had to get another one, and then she has to figure out what the heck is going on with all the spreadsheets, right? But what we've done is we have access to their drive, and we've started to map some of their information to Darwin Core. And that's a record for you Darwin Core fans in the room. And apparently the people that do this say, oh, it's brilliant, it's so easy, it's so well organized, it's going to map so easily. And I'm like, okay, great, cool. But it's been a long time coming. We've been talking to these folks for probably almost 2 years now. And again, it's the staff turnover thing that's been problematic, really. But hopefully now we're starting to build some momentum. I have to talk to her again in a couple weeks and say, so you ready to go on that project yet, or what? Yes.
Sorry, I'm now really curious about the spreadsheets that they had. Like, what were they in? Was it just Excel spreadsheets?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that's what I said. So,
Yeah.
like, totally not linked to each other at all, just like individual spreadsheets, or was there any aspect of a database to it? Or was
Not
it
really.
just-
They have, I'm trying to remember what it looks like. I haven't been in there for a while. They have sort of a file hierarchy, but they have an interesting thing going on in which they have multiple collaborators, because they don't always get to go to Australia to sample from the Great Barrier Reef, and so they rely on scientists down there to do this stuff. And of course, everybody has slightly different practices, so some of them have these beautiful file structures, and it's very clear what relates to what, and some of them have a lot more information in terms of things like details about the collection location and how brackish the water is, and some of them leave a lot of that blank. So I think what Charlotte, the new staff scientist, is trying to do is she's trying to figure out what the heck is going on back there, because there is some variability that we saw even in our very quick glance at things. But a lot of the really key pieces are fairly rigidly organized, and so it's going to be fairly easy to at least pull out the information for the public face, because there's not that much in there. Their back-end laboratory management part is going to be a little more tricky, but that's a little bit down the line. So we're really excited about this project, and we hope it starts to gather steam, because this is a perfect fit for us, because it would solve problems for them in terms of, right now they can't search for samples by location, and it's really easy to do that for us. So you can say, show me everything that's collected in Bermuda, and then you could do it, and you can't do it in their current setup. So.
See why the current setup is really slow running too, because if that program is searching through all of these spreadsheets,
Mm-hmm.
No wonder it's slow.
It's very, yeah, it's a little kludgy. I think they've outgrown their system a bit. So that's where things stand with that. I'm going to back up a bit and talk about the repository again a little bit. I'm so happy to stand up here and tell you, because the last time I talked to this class, the repository still wasn't live, but now it is. Woo! I'm like you with the Darwin Core. Woo! We went live January, February, I think, and now that that thing is up and running, it has made my life as a person that works with data management plans a lot easier, and it's made a lot of our lives a lot easier, because now we can point to an existing thing and say, this is what your content would look like. We've pulled in all of the content from the previous repository, which was called IRIS, so this is things like dissertations and theses and papers. A lot of archives and special collections, digital objects are in there now, not everything, and Marcom continues to add their pictures. The last time I looked, they have about 30,000 or something like that in there. We have streaming video now, so NIEC is the National Interpretive Education Center. Thank you, yeah, that. Sign language teaching videos are in there now, streaming. But the research data is really just beginning, and I was going to click on that and show you, but it's really not very exciting. There's some people who have uploaded code, actually, and a little bit of research data. But when I download it, it's just a zip file, and it's not very dramatic, so I'm not going to bother. But it's available, and I think it's actually viewable in public, in the public view, if you know who to look for. We have some challenges with the repository, and one is the interesting question of the future funding model. Very interesting question. You're all chuckling, right? Because you've probably talked about this before. So the way things stand right now, we have seed funding from the provost for 2 years, I think it is, which is enough to provision storage for all the departments on campus. Not a lot of storage, but some. And that's the model under which we're up and running. We have since switched provosts. Gotta love academia, right? So the future is in flux, and so we're actively talking about how are we going to keep this thing up and running in the future, because we're selling it as a preservation thing, right? And I'm saying you should deposit your data here and then write your data management plan to say we're putting it in the repository because it's going to be there, right? So one of the solutions that's being bandied about is to attach to grants and to take like a little tiny percentage off the top. Of course, that is problematic. For every solution is problematic, but that is problematic, of course, because as we said earlier, this is a cyclical funding thing, and grants go away. And of course, there are also a ton of projects that are not grant funded that are certainly appropriate and great candidates to go in here, and how do you pay for those? So thankfully that discussion is happening at pay grades far above mine, and I don't really worry about that too much. The internal communications has been really interesting. I never in a million years would have guessed that internal communication within the library would have been the challenge here. I would have thought that explaining to people outside the library what this thing is and what it's good for would have been hard. I think the library internal piece is actually harder, to my surprise. And it's, I don't know entirely why that is. I think it would be, I think one thing is we've been so excited to get this thing up and running and to bring on board anybody who wants to participate. And some of these big projects like OGL, we're footing the bill for, right? We're not going to charge them because we need things like that in the collection to show people. But there's a lot of kind of confusion about what this thing can be used for. And some people are conflating it with the previous repository and thinking it's for papers. And it's not, it's for all kinds of things. Some of us have been saying you really need to put in the hands of the liaisons some information, some just general information that says this is the kind of stuff that we can take and this is the kind of stuff we really shouldn't take. Really broad strokes guidelines. We haven't gotten that. And so that makes the conversations really hard. Because again, we're encouraged to say, it's great, it can take everything. But I've already had conversations with 2 researchers who I had to say no to. And I knew when talking to them that it was highly unlikely we'd be able to take their stuff. So one situation was we had a researcher in electrical engineering who had still images of monkey videos, no joke, that he was using for his research. And he said, I want to put these in the repository. And I said, okay, well, that might work. And he said, it's 40 terabytes. And I went, I don't think so, but I'm going to get back to you. And I talked to, my folks over on the repository side, and they're like, no. So we took some of his other things instead. We took his white papers, and we took some of his internal lab documentation. He's happy with that. And we said, really, your monkey videos you should probably keep on your hard drive in your lab. So we don't even really have information about what size is outrageous. And that's something we probably should have. And it may be forthcoming. I mean, we've been scrambling to get this thing up and running, so the communication piece has been lagging behind a little bit. Another funny conversation I had with a researcher who was new and coming in from another organization sent me a message, and I'm going to quote because it made me chuckle. She said, I'm bringing with me a data set that I would call HIPAA-ish. Can I put this in the repository? And again, I'm sort of like, I think probably not, but let me find it. And they said, no, are you kidding me? You don't want that in there. So it's hard to talk to your public without knowing. The rule of thumb we've been going by is we take almost everything except stuff that we know when we see it isn't appropriate. And that's really kind of hard to articulate. But I think it's getting better. Part of the thing that we've stumbled with, too, is historically the liaisons have been the people that talk to the faculty and the staff at my institution. And now the repository manager is starting to talk to the staff and the faculty, and people are like, aren't you going to involve us with that? And that's getting better. I think we have a pretty good model for how that works. There's been an interesting confusion on the part of the researchers and the faculty, too, actually. We've sort of shot ourselves in the foot. We've made it so simple to use and upload that some folks are sort of thinking of this as their own little Dropbox almost. And there's been some funny cross communications when they try to delete something and they're like, where is the delete button? And the repository manager has to say, so this is a preservation system. And the whole idea is that we save things. And, we give them so much control over how they design their collections and who they allow to have permissions. Of course, they're expecting to be able to delete things they put up there that they put in the wrong place or they didn't want access to. Yeah, right. So that has been an interesting hurdle to overcome, and we have provision for sort of a delete mechanism in which there's a delete button that doesn't actually delete anything, but alerts the repository manager to do something. Yeah.
So, Jen, do you have memorandums of understanding, little things like that when somebody, other than the form that they fill out before that they're going to deposit anything? I mean, for a big project, do you have a memorandum?
I don't think it's been as formal as that, no. I mean, now, when I went with the repository manager yesterday and talked to the dean, I noticed that she was very quick to say, and there's no way to delete, which she doesn't normally say. So, no, I don't think so. It's been pretty informal to this point, and that might be an interesting thing to develop. I think the rush was to get the thing up and running, and maybe the communication piece is following, bringing up the rear. But yeah, it's an interesting question.
It's understandable. I think the biggest hurdle, of course, is the funding.
Yeah.
Because staff time. I mean, you've got some big projects there, and even though you're trying to make it as easy as possible,
There's still staff time.
There's still staff time behind the scenes. I mean, just the ocean project alone, which is fabulous. That translates into money.
Yeah.
Budgetary.
Absolutely. I would agree.
But there's good news, I think. There's an interesting opportunity for all of us. It's interesting that there seems to be this shared sense of urgency. I mean, we saw scientists lamenting the problem with raw data disappearing, right, in the current biology paper that Megan so kindly summarized for us. And they've gone to the lengths of making, for example, things like the IsoTab software to try to wrangle data and make it a little more understandable. librarians are kind of doing the same thing. We're learning as we go, for sure, and we're learning a lot. I think that we didn't know very well about how researchers work in the sciences, especially. I think we have a really good grasp historically on how social scientists work and humanities folks work. We certainly have a good grasp on the teaching enterprise, the teaching part of university and college life, but I think the scientific research endeavor has been maybe a little bit of a black hole. And the fact that librarians are getting out there and becoming involved in these projects and talking to people about what they're doing is, I think it's fabulous. Even if it takes forever and is frustrating and doesn't seem to go anywhere, you have staff who have great intel on what's happening on campus, and that can be communicated up, and it can inform the library in terms of its strategic directions, and it just gives you another way to interface, I think, with your colleagues on campus, which is fantastic. But as you saw from looking at 5 million tools, it sort of remains to be seen, I think, whether we're all going to try to solve this problem in our own little silos, or actually talk to each other and come to some agreement about what's important to tackle and what can go by the wayside. It's going to be really interesting because I think there are some disciplinary hurdles to overcome. So we'll see. Hopefully it works out well. Sure. Thank you.
Any remaining questions for Jen?
For personal interest about the sign language
Oh yeah.
videos that you have, is it just video content, or is it? I know there's something called Elon, which is a great annotation thing of sign language video. Is it like that kind of data, or?
I actually have never looked at it. I recently found out that they were up because we only recently got the streaming capability up and running.
Okay.
So I haven't looked at them. They may be publicly available. Take a look. Yeah, if they're not, I can take a look.
Or do you know if they have subtitles with them?
I have no idea. That would make
I
sense,
didn't know
right?
if you had viewed it.
I've never looked at them.
Okay.
No, I should. Yeah.
Could you demo the repository for us? Is that possible?
Yeah.
Do we have time? Did you guys have a?
Do you have interviews?
I didn't join the Simmons internet thing, so you can, let me see if it doesn't need a password then.
Live demos can on that. You never know what's gonna happen.
Do we have time for that? I don't know
Yeah,
if you
it's-
guys had a plan
it's just-
after.
Oh,
Did we have any plans after?
no.
No Back to the Future viewing.
Yeah.
While I was thinking, I was gonna. Oh, never mind.
I'm sure there's more screens for me to go through. I agreed to this acceptable use policy that I'm not reading.
Yeah. Well, you're not doing anything illegal.
Not yet.
Okay.
Nice, yeah.
Yeah. Are you involved at all in the fish thing? Ocean Genome Legacy?
Yes, and it's partly because those are my people. I'm the biology liaison.
Oh, okay.
And it's partly because some of that is data. So yeah, I'm the person talking with them along with the repository manager. They haven't had to talk to anybody else yet.
Because I was going to ask you more questions about how that's also being handled, because I'm
Just the cool one.
fascinated by what you would, okay, you're presented with this thing, and you can think of it as just this big sort of problem, not an unsolvable, but like
Right.
a problem that to tackle. And I'm curious about the steps that it takes to get to tackle it, because like I know certain little things that I would think to do personally when given this
Right.
this mess, but I don't know what, like, my first thought is very data sciencey and not as librarian-y, which is funny to me, like, to be noticing for myself, like, oh, what would I do in that situation? It's not what you're doing, which means that I'm learning from what you're
Well,
doing.
what would
I
you
think
do
it's
first?
I would try to put it into a MySQL database and create links between fields. You know what I mean?
Associations.
Yeah, I would associate fields that way, and so I could get a mental picture of the structure of it, and I would also run all the data, because it sounds like it's some of it's kind of dirty data.
Yeah.
I would run it through OpenRefine and try to clean it up, because that is amazing and magic, and if you've never heard of it, I'm so into it. We've already talked I've already established with several people here that I'm really into OpenRefine for cleaning up dirty data, because it's the best thing ever, and you can oh my god, it's magic. But those are things that I would know to do, but I don't know very much. I'm going to learn about DO and core next semester because I'm taking metadata, but right now, looking at it, I'm not. I wouldn't know how to because then I would get it there and I'd be like, great, it's in a MySQL database, awesome. Now what? Which is definitely not finished. That would not be done.
Yeah.
That would be okay, now it's someplace else and it's cleaner and it's more organized and it's not actually ready for public consumption.
It's tough. I think my perception is that when they started to talk to us about the back-end laboratory information management piece, I got all geeked out about that, because that used to be my mess to deal with. I was like, oh, you're going to make maps in the freezer boxes. That's so awesome. Woo! But like the Darwin Core. But my colleagues were like, let's talk about that in, 5 years. And we're going to focus on pulling enough of the data out so that we can make a nice catalog interface for your public stuff. And I think somebody at one point said, shouldn't they be solving the laboratory information problem themselves? I don't know. I don't know where you draw that boundary. And I mean, it's a minor point, but these folks work in Nahant too. So we can't run across the street and help them either. So I think we're a little loath to get too in there reconfiguring things for them. I mean, certainly we could say, well, you might want to think about it in MySQL database, because then you don't have 60 spreadsheets.
Unconnected spreadsheets with data that crosses over.
Right. So there's a little hesitancy to be too into the way people do business daily, I think, because you start to cross the line between we're here to preserve your finished and public stuff long term, and that's all you. I don't know. But there certainly could be things that are done on the back end that would make serving it up to the public easier, right? So I don't know what you guys want to see. This is a person. This is Mr. Monkey Video guy. He has a bunch of different collections. He's a person who's deposited some code and data, and I would download this, but the computer would be like, what? So it's not very exciting. Yeah.
Usually I would think you'd go to GitHub.
But it's not for preservation though. GitHub can't preserve things.
Well, that's true.
I think he's putting it in both places. I remember when we talked to him a while ago, he said he's like a dream. He's a dream person to work with. I've gone aphasic now that it's this late in the day. Because when he contacted us, he said, I want to make my data more, I want to make my research more transparent and discoverable to people. And we do a lot of things like white papers. This guy's in EECS, and he sort of crosses the boundary into health sciences a little bit. So much of what we do is not stuff that's published scholarly. And I want to make a name for my lab group, and I want people to be able to find the stuff that is not picked up by the scholarly record. And we're like, where have you been all our lives? He's like, yay. So this is a person who is, he did a little work with Sarah, our repository manager, to get his collection set up, but now he's just going, and he's just uploading. And so he is an example. He's the first person I know of who has put code in here, and so you can see some of the metadata. Maybe that's tiny, isn't it? So I think a human was involved in making this, and it's sparse, right? I mean, there's not much to it. I'm not sure if this was work that was done by I think this is stuff that he did himself, actually.
How much of the metadata data that we're looking at is limited vocabulary. Like it said metadata code or something like I don't remember what it said, but it had things that could be like something in multimedia. Like I could totally see that being a limited vocabulary, but I could also see him typing it in. So
I am willing to bet that a lot of this is self-applied, like full text, free text sort of stuff. I mean, the exception to that might be there's a lot of archival collections in here now, and presumably they probably have some nice metadata, one would hope. I'm sure they do. Let me see if I can find.
So if I'm
The nice videos, right?
if someone is doing a like project where they need a data set, is this a place they could go to and download data from and use as a data set?
Yep, as long as the person who put it in there has given the right permission.
Do you have any cognitive scientists who have put data sets up?
I don't think so. We have very few people who put data sets up at this point.
data-related class.
Okay.
So I'm looking for like online data sets that are available. I just found PubMed's open access thing, and I found a couple cognitive science journals that are there. So I think I'm good, but I thought.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think so. If there was somebody in STEM that was doing it, somebody would have probably given me the heads up.
Yeah.
I hope. Usually the case. I'm actually not sure where these are, so I'm just clicking around like a crazy person. Woo!
While watching you.
No, we don't want meetings. God. Ugh. Witnesses? Really? What is this? Huh. Oh, there's nothing in here. Darn. I'm all excited. One of the things that I've heard our manager encouraging people to do.
That's it at work, so
Okay.
it's a mantra.
It looks like it's mostly shells. I have some superpowers and I'm logged in, so I should be able to see stuff if it's here. It may just not be here yet. What did I start to say? I can't even remember. Oh, we're encouraging people to deposit things like their IRB stuff alongside their studies. Because again, we can make the permissions very granular so that nobody can see it, but it's linked. Right. Well, yeah. I keep ending up in the meetings loop.
Well, you're looking at that. Do you have persistent identifiers?
Yeah. Yep. That's one of the big selling points, of course, and persistent URLs. Yeah.
You guys are hosting it, the persistent identifier? Is that how it works?
I'm not sure if we're contracting out to have it, or if we're doing it ourselves, to be honest. Just, I can't talk and click at the same time. It's like an occupational issue.
I started that, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, this is interesting. Do you know I'm not seeing it? I would think I would be able to, but maybe not. They tell me they're in here. Interesting, huh? I am not really sure, to be honest, how it's being done. But yeah, that's one of our big selling points is, we can make it so that it's found even if the repository changes names or gets hosted by Bing or who knows what the future holds, right? Brought to you by Bing. So yeah, that's it. And a lot of what is in here, again, is the Marcom photos and its archives and special collections, but they've set up collections for the various communities and groups. One of the great things about the way this is designed is Northeastern is an interesting place when it comes to there is no clear path of this person belongs to this department and this department belongs to this college, which is the case in most universities. Instead, more and more we bring on faculty and say your primary appointment is in the College of Social Sciences, but you're going to also report, you're also going to have an affiliation with engineering. And that makes designing the collections really interesting, and actually that's one reason we walked away from the conventional repository world, was that it was impossible to build all of the weird permutations of relationship of this person. So like one of my favorite faculty members has his appointment in the policy school, I think, public policy. But he also has an appointment in engineering, and he's really an environmental economist. So how you describe those relationships is very tricky unless you have a nice flexible thing. And here we can say this guy actually, believe it or not, belongs in engineering, and he belongs over here, he belongs over here, and it's pretty simple. Yeah. It makes it very interesting to figure out who the liaison is sometimes. And how to purchase materials for that person, right? It's like, does this come out of biology or, yeah.
I mean, you go into an environmental studies program in any, college across the country, it's a nightmare. It really is to try to figure out your collections budget for that and how to do outreach. And that's just one.
Yeah.
That's just one.
Anyway, that's it. I'm sorry I couldn't pull up the videos. Don't know what's up with that.
No, but this is really interesting to see. So is it nested community style? Is that how do you find somebody? Like if I was going in and or like if I wanted to find like a data set in the humanities or something, how would I do that?
It's so funny you mentioned this. This isn't something I mentioned, but this is one of the things we're sort of wrestling with internally is this thing supposed you would think that we would have made all these decisions, right? But it's funny how you figure things out as you go sometimes. One of the things we're struggling with is the more public-facing folks are saying, you can't browse this. You can't search it. How do I just find a data set in the humanities? There's no easy way to do that right now because it was designed, again, to be an archive, right? And it was designed to be, these are all the things that belong to Joe faculty member. His publications, his presentations, his data sets, his teaching objects, his grad students' work. And it's not, so one of the things that we're talking about is this supposed to be a discovery layer in and of itself, or is it supposed to be a thing that you give handles to so that people can find your work? And we're not really sure, I guess.
It looked like there was a handle on the
Yeah.
that you showed us.
On the code thing?
When we were inside of the metadata.
Inside the metadata.
Inside of the person as they're looking at the metadata.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Inside the metadata.
Oh, type, collection. I think that's right. It's organized. Right, so the collection is predicated on the person with which all of the objects are affiliated. Did I answer your question? I'm not sure I did.
You were going to show us the metadata
Thank
for
you.
an object.
Like this?
Yeah.
So this is the URL and it's through handle.net.
But is that something that he put up
You
because
share.
he already has a handle to?
I don't think so, but I'm not positive, to be honest. It's a good question.
And does that handle go to this site, or does it go to somewhere else that he also has that same code?
If it's anything like
Ugh.
DOI, it should redirect to the site.
Let's see what it does.
Yeah.
It went right back.
It
to
went
there.
back.
Okay.
Oh, so that's for that record.
Mhm.
And so the zip file would be where the actual code is.
Yep.
Alright. So if this person wanted to share, it would give that URL.
Yep.
Yep. And it's open. You wouldn't need a username or password, Northeastern.
As long as he has not protected this.
Protected it.
Yes. But things, if I remember correctly, are protected at the collection level,
Okay,
not at the item,
I see.
if that makes any sense. That is something else that has been difficult to convey to people.
The collection level is protected, but not the item level. What if you have like a collection that most things are open and like one thing you're like, I'm really not ready to share this.
Collection for it.
Okay.
Collection of things that belong in folder X, but I'm not showing it.
Which is basically the same thing as an archive.
Yeah.
Like if in archives you'll have like somebody's collection and then you might have certain things that are restricted.
Mhm.
Or like this is the box of restricted things and here's like a little note that says there would be things that make logical sense to be here,
Right.
but are actually over here because they're, HIPAA.
Can't see them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it definitely is very structured like an archive,
Yeah, that's true.
basically, instead of it's not like a digital library or anything. So it's not like browse heavy, but it's very much archive style, which makes sense. And then you have the different restriction levels and the different. I mean, if I start thinking of it like that instead of like a typical,
Right.
whatever that means, digital repository, I think the logic suddenly makes perfect sense.
Right.
Maybe when you're explaining it,
That's a good point.
that's
It's not
the trick.
Yeah.
It really, because like if it's done by the person, right, or the department, that's how archives do it. Like the president's office is treated like a person, and their archives are
Right. By creator.
exactly. Wait, by what?
By creator.
Yeah, by creator, and so it's like the president's office or the media outreach.
Right, Marcom. Yeah.
Thank you.
Marketing, communications.
The marketing communications office would have its, archives with like folders and boxes and whatnot. But in this case, that's cool. That makes sense.
Is one of the permissions level can be seen by anyone who has this URL? Like, so you can't find it?
Like Google Drive.
Yes.
um,
That is why I had that thought.
I don't think so. No. My understanding is the permission levels are based on basically you can slice and dice the Northeastern community in a million different ways. Like say all faculty and staff, say only people in this department, say students but only the students I name. Or so you can do a lot of things very granularly within the institution, but then outside it, it's or public. I believe. Not positive.
Now I have
Yeah.
So I will be quizzing you about your
Should have had Sarah come in instead.
This has been really good. I was curious if you've got collaborators and they're working on the same project, but you're structuring everything by creator. Does then that collaboration become a creator, or can you add to let's say this guy takes somebody on to help with his monkey project, and they are like, what if they take over the monkey project completely, and they suddenly all of the new creations should be with intellectually they should be with his stuff, but also intellectually they should be under this new person's stuff. Is it structured to deal with somebody else adding to their collection? Do you have to sort of bypass that and the new person signs in as him and pretends to be him and deposits things?
I don't think so. Yeah. I think so. I was clicking as you were talking because this B spiral is something kind of like that, where it is several different faculty members. And what I see is not really informing me about how it's set up. CSL products.
I like biomedical signal processing imaging.
It's good stuff, right?
I've said that sentence before. No, I definitely have.
dreamt it last night.
Yeah, I actually, I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm sure that, however, I don't know that the folks could do it themselves. I'm sure that Sarah could change it.
Sure. Change it from the former person to the new
Yes.
person? Okay. And would that be recorded? If I'm thinking of it
As
an
a, yep.
it makes a lot of sense for, what's the word that starts with P that I always forget?
Provenance.
Provenance. It would make a lot of sense to keep that connection. I mean, it seems
To memorialize it
good
and say, this
easily.
transferred from this person to this one. Yeah.
'Cause then you have a whole nother person making records. I'm sorry, I'm just laughing. Provenance.
No, it's a good question. I don't know for sure.
Yeah.
But
Well, I mean, it's a baby project.
and yeah, we're still
And
trying to
then it's
learn.
still
You know,
wild,
it's,
wild,
yeah.
Absolutely.
If I were thinking about it, now I'm getting all nerdy and excited about your repository. But when I think about it, it makes total sense because it's the or not, it's digital, you can structure it all sorts of ways. You could have it be like, this collection is associated with this person and this person and this collaboration, and you could sort of have all of those creators at the same time. It doesn't have to be mutually exclusive, unless you choose to make it mutually exclusive. It doesn't have to be inherently, because it's not like an archives that's physical. You have like, okay, what do I put this in? There's 2 boxes, and I can't put this folder in both. Like, you can actually,
Would
you
you
can
all
do that.
Would you have duplications of folders, or would you have it, if I went through collaborator 1 and through collaborator 2, it points to the
I
same
would do
place?
the second one, yeah. Like it points to the same place. Either like you start with collaborator A, collaborator B, or you could come to it through the collaboration.
Yeah. So
Is-
like a mark record, like it just have
Exactly,
a
it
lot
have
of
Yeah.
associated names, like all
Yeah.
of the names that Dr. Seuss is under in Library of Congress.
sort of. I was thinking of it a little bit differently than that, because you won't find anything by his other names. Instead, I was more thinking of like, you have an object that's created by different people and a collaboration, and that all of those would be simultaneously accurate.
Right.
Does that
Right,
make sense?
yeah.
Whereas like with the Dr. Seuss with the Muck record, in that case there's really only one answer.
One is
one
most
correct.
accurate.
Yeah.
Right.
Whereas these
I guess
would
I was
be-
thinking like if you search for Dr. Seuss and then something in the system is like redirecting
Uh-huh.
Oh, you
Because-
would get directed to the Theory
Correct.
Geisel
The-
page
right.
if you search under.
you like an authority file.
I wasn't thinking of it that way at all. I
That's a
was thinking-
separate thing from what
Yeah,
you're talking
yeah.
about.
But
so.
I mean that would also be really valuable, and I imagine that that's something that they'll do with like keywords and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's funny that we have suddenly realized that as a front end it's not all that usable in some ways, right? But if you think of it as an archive, I guess that makes sense.
It's suddenly very usable and it makes complete intellectual sense.
But another, to that point, another sort of metaphysical dilemma we've had down the road is, should we serve some of these objects or all of these objects up as part of our discovery layer for the library itself? Because we can do that. And so one of my fun side projects is dealing with the discovery layer, and so we talked about that for quite a bit, because I mean the idea is to make this stuff discoverable and usable, and we can connect them fairly easily, but ultimately we said they seem like 2 different things to us. Yep. And so one of the roads that we went down was, the running joke in meetings was, so you're going to search for sociology so it's Primo, we have Primo, and you're going to get all the sociology department's newsletters. And people who are searching for sociology probably don't want the sociology department's newsletters. And so then we went down the road of maybe we will only surface certain objects, and they will be the objects to which we apply human-supplied metadata that we deem, that we used to call the glowing buckets, like the important things. I work with a bunch of wacky people. What can I say? The glowing buckets. So we'll only, or the best bits. We'll only show the best bits in Primo. But then we said, well, that doesn't make any sense, because most of the best bits are going to be published papers, which are already in there, and they're going to fight with each other. And it's going to confuse everybody. And so ultimately what we've done is we've put a link to the repository in the discovery layer and have said, if you want this stuff, go find it. And and now we've realized that it's not actually that easy to find stuff in here. And so it's fun to be a librarian. It's interesting times.
So many exciting thoughts.
So one thing I want to ask you, when we're talking about tools, and certainly the Northeastern repository is a tool for people who are doing research data management services, such as yourself. And what other tool do you find, you and your department and your liaisons, find the most useful, or is there more than one?
Specifically for data?
For data or for the services that you provide that helps you?
People are doing so many different things that it's really hard to say, I think. We make pretty heavy use of DMP tool.
I was going to ask that. Do you use that?
Yeah. Yeah, I point people to that pretty often, and that's what I have to talk about. Tomorrow, Sarah's going to give the other half of that talk. This is going to be a new one for us. It's going to be interesting. So for Open Access Month, because a week doesn't just cut it, I'm going to spend about 20 minutes showing how DMP tool works to manage your data, and then she's going to show how easy it is to deposit data into the repository. Because for me, the conversations about data management always flow very easily into how do you plan to store your stuff, and are you happy with it? You're happy with the solution you have, and 90% of the time they're like, no. And sometimes the repository is a good option for them to consider. So, yeah, I use DMP tool a fair bit. A little bit, yeah. We have some custom. You want to see that too? No. We have some custom links, not super customized. We have made at least one institutional template, I think. For the humanities. Yeah, I think it's I think especially the new iteration of DMP tool is pretty easy to use and it's helpful. The first one, maybe not so much, yeah. And the thing that people, from my standpoint, always ask me for are example plans. And there's tons of those in there. I mean, I can't vouch for how great they are, but there's tons of them in there. One of the things that we did for our presentation tomorrow was I said, you know, it'd be a lot more interesting if we demo a project. And so it's a little less esoteric than talking about, think about your file types and whether they're proprietary. And so we came up with a fake research project for which I made a fake DMP, which do you guys do that too? You made a DMP? That was the first time I've ever had to make a data management plan, right? I was like, God, this takes forever. It's no wonder people don't like doing this. So yeah, I made one for our presentation yesterday, and I thought, wow, this really takes a long time. Fun. It does take a long time. Yeah, I guess so. It takes a long time.
Would it be still the same project if we used a tool to make our DMP? I don't know.
Use the DMP tool.
Like use the DMP.
Or like, I'm sure there are other things that help you make a DMP.
No,
Maybe not. What? It wouldn't be.
Well, I think the important thing, and we'll go over this with you, about the final project, is to really understand the construction of a DMP tool and what has to go in there, and how you're going to communicate this, to the researcher.
Okay.
And the DMP tool is great, right? Because everything is in there in terms of maybe standard language for IT or for the library or for repositories. But when you're learning about how to do a DMP, maybe it would be better to create one.
Do it yourself first.
On your own. Certainly there are plenty of examples out there.
Mm-hmm.
Through the DMP tool itself, and through NECDMC, through those types of things.
And the data models and everything.
The data models. What types of metadata are you going to suggest for this? So there's information out there about it, but you really need to understand what goes into a data management plan. So not to be,
That makes sense.
because if you don't understand the researcher, they'll just put in some good stuff and some bad stuff, right?
Yeah, and I've recently talked to a couple of people who contacted me because they were denied based on their DMPs, and that's pretty new. Yep, both NSF, two different directorates, but both NSF.
Yeah, and remember we talked a couple of weeks ago about the compliance now is going to be very important.
Mm-hmm.
So I forget the type of research. Oh, you looked at the sign language and children on the autism spectrum. And so, where was I going with this? You would need to know about possible metadata schemas for that, you would need to try to understand where they could reposit this type of information. Especially with IRB concerns, are there any HIPAA concerns?
Yeah.
I mean, you need to be able to discuss this with your researchers. And with compliance issues, which are so important, you have to be able to talk to them about this. And if it comes back with, why is it not compliant?
Yeah.
And that means you would go to the federal agency and read what their standards are. So, sorry, I didn't mean to.
That's okay.
Great. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you,
Yeah,
guys.
thanks.
It's been a pleasure.